Good evening, Alejandro. It's nice to have you with us in Regulation and Governance with your new paper with Rob Glicksman. Can you tell us what the paper is about?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me talk about this. I love talking about my work. So the article of it, sort of the paper really considers the importance of better understanding the structural relationship between institutions in designing and evaluating governance. And so in many ways, the paper, it sort of meets the literature where it's at, which is that, scholars and policymakers have looked a lot, particularly recently, at the role of intergovernmental organizational design. And they've provided a lot of important insights into the trade-offs of sort of alternative structural options. But what the article tries to do there is sort of synthesize that literature and build on it by sort of offering what we think is a pretty novel framework for characterizing, analyzing, and of course, ultimately structuring governmental authority across different public institutions.
Yeah, interesting. So this is a kind of a paper on theory of governance, and how do we deal with how we design better governance in a way. And what is the main problems that underlines the discussions that you are doing?
Well, I think what happens is, when you're talking about from the policymakers' perspective, it's often the case, government is often organized or reorganized, and certainly a lot of attention is provided to the extent that the authority attention is paid to sort of how government or governance should be structured. A lot of it is focused on sort of what we would call a substantive authority, sort of the rules, the standards that are applied, and then sort of also, secondarily to the processes that are used to implement those substantive rules. But and less attention is paid to sort of the structure of government, and to the extent that it is done, a lot of it focuses on certain particular components of the governmental structure without thinking more holistically about the different kinds of trade-offs that occur depending on what we call the different dimensions of authority, as well as the different functions of government.
Yeah. So what is, when you say structure of government or governance, what do you mean?
So we're really talking about, in many ways, who authority is allocated to. So, and more importantly, because we live in a modern administrative bureaucracy in virtually every developed and also developing country, there is quite a bit of different intergovernmental relationships. And so whenever a new program is created or one is reorganized, there are various different trade-offs that exist in deciding who is allocated authority and what particular authority they are provided. And so in many ways, our structure, our framework, what it does is it suggests, first of all, that authority can be structured along one of three different dimensions. And in fact, every set of authority is at least implicitly allocated authority along each of these different dimensions. One of them is...
Just to make it clearer. So we have a problem of division of authority within government. We have, and this is can be also thought about as a problem of cooperation, but also coordination. And your new ideas, or the way you approach this problem is novel. This is why you wrote the paper. And what is your innovation? What do you bring to the literature, and in which way?
Sure. So it's really fundamentally two fundamental descriptive points that we make. The first one is that authority can be structured along three different dimensions. One of those dimensions is centralization and decentralization. So authority can be more centralized or decentralized. A second dimension is the extent that the authority is overlapping. So authority on one end could be quite a bit of overlap, and on the other end, it could be distinct. And then the third dimension is the extent that the authority is coordinated. So on one end of the dimension, authority can be highly coordinated, and on the other end, it can be exercised independently.
Yeah.
So that is, so that's the first insight. So we're talking about the different dimensions of authority. The second,
so I'd like to
happy to talk
stop you here. And can you give me examples of those three dimensions? So centralization, decentralization.
Right. So authority can be that centralization is often thought of. The extent of centralization can often be thought about as a matter of scale, right? To what extent should be centralized to a national government, more to a provincial government, or to a local authority. Although the extent of centralization can vary within a level of government too. So you could have more or less centralized national authority, but that is one of the dimensions. For overlap, of course, you could have authority that is completely overlapping, where you have, for example, various different federal agencies or national agencies that are given authority over, let's say, wildlife management, where there are different, one is in charge of certain federal lands, and other one's focused on particular species, where there's overlap. Or you can have distinct authority, right? So this, an obvious example of this might be when you've got either various different provincial governments, each having authority over something, where the authority is not overlapping. And then the third, of course, is coordinated versus independent. You could have authority that is highly coordinated, hierarchical. In fact, coordination, we go in through the paper, describe it as actually quite heterogeneous. You could have fairly central, you could have fairly hierarchical coordination, but you could have also sort of
network,
sort of equivalent authority that is highly coordinated, sort of reciprocal or collaborative. But you can also have independent authority that is in fact sometimes intentionally meant to be competitive and adversarial. And in fact, there are some scholars who point out the advantages of having sort of intergovernmental competition and we think of that competition as being primarily a function, not of what it's often thought of as centralization or decentralization, but really a matter of to the extent the authority is coordinated or independent, because you can have centralized competition between agencies, and you could also have fairly independent, fairly cooperative, decentralized authority.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the key findings or sort of assertions is that authority can be structured along these different dimensions, and there are different trade-offs that exist depending on where you go along each dimension. The second sort of insight, which is in some ways small, but I think when it combines with the first insight, really it lends to a rich framework, is that the allocations of authority can, and in many cases should be varied for disparate governmental functions. So what I mean by this is, of course, when authority is allocated, we often think of authority being allocated for immigration or for environmental, or sort of what we call substantive authority. But of course, implicit, at least, in every sort of allocation is also a set of functions. So the agency might be given authority over, for example, immigration, but they might be only given authority over standard setting or implementation or enforcement or monitoring or funding. And then, of course, this point, what we call sort of functional jurisdiction, every authority that is allocated includes a substantive and a functional component. But understanding authority, and of course, what dimension, where to move authority along any particular dimension will vary. The trade-offs will vary depending on what particular function or functions are being assessed. So together, we think that in virtually every regulatory context, understanding these different dimensions, and particularly assessing, characterizing and assessing the different functions along these dimensions, can be a really rich set of tools for better, again, understanding and again designing regulatory authority.
So you think that part of those kind of governance failure or regulatory failure are due to this kind of thin theory of governance, and that in a way your insights bring benefits for both theory and policymaker. Can you be more specific about that? Give example.
Sure,
for example,
sure.
I know that you wrote a book on the subject, and maybe you can provide examples from this.
Sure, of course. So the article does provide short little snippets of examples, but you're right. Rob Glicksman and I both wrote a book that this article in many ways builds on. That's called Reorganizing Government, where we provide various different chapters that look at particular aspects of particular components of this framework and demonstrate, for example, why conflation of some of these dimensions leads to problems in particular examples, or again, ignoring the different dimensions, ignoring the different functions, also can lead to problems. So in examples that range from securities regulation and banking regulation, intelligence gathering by national security agencies, climate governance, pollution control, food safety, we see various different examples where a very common sort of mistake, for example, is one where agencies or policymakers and scholars will even identify a problem of as they self-describe it as too little coordination, and that the solution that they offer, though, is increased centralization rather than thinking about modes of coordination. And you can imagine a cascading set of different sorts of mistakes that are often made, where people conflate different dimensions and say, well, there's too much decentralization, so the solution isn't centralization. The solution that they come up with is increasing coordination. Or again, another one will be, they say there's too much overlap, it's redundancy, wastefulness, et cetera. And what do? They increase coordination to deal with the problem rather than reducing overlap. So policymakers, government organization is complicated, is already complicated as it is, but it's also misunderstood. And we think that, this framework helps explains it better. And again, we think it's useful regardless of your political proclivities, whether you're conservative or progressive policymaker, sort of better understanding authority and the trade-offs that occur will likely lead to better regulatory success. For scholars, we think, we certainly in the paper try to make a call to regulation and governance scholars to sort of harness this framework that we think builds on the existing literature to help build this body of empirical evidence upon which policymakers can draw in future regulatory design alternatives. Because one of the things that we found in our research is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, though people will often discuss the different trade-offs that exist, they don't often use our framework, but more importantly, the regulators and scholars, there's really a dearth of sort of empirical evidence assessing the success of particular regulatory programs. So we hope that this paper in many ways provides both scholars and policymakers the impetus to sort of study individual examples like we have, but we've only looked at a few, to sort of emerge, to pull out some lessons that exist about what different trade-offs actually exist in different contexts, and hopefully provide that sort of empirical body of information that sort of drawing on empirical and sort of experimentalist literature that we do, hopefully provides a more effective form of both regulation and governance moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alejandro.
Thank you.